when it comes to investing in our health and improving our health, when it comes to eating maybe a more nutritious diet, eating less junk, eating more good food, when it comes to exercise, when we start out, it takes a lot of effort. It takes a huge investment of energy. If we're used to eating a certain way, eating a certain diet for a long time, and then we have to, maybe make some drastic changes, it's really hard. It's very, very hard to make drastic changes in what we eat. It's very hard to start really exercising properly if we haven't done much exercise at all for a long time. It takes a lot of effort. That's true. But it's also true that if we put in that effort and if we make a start and we get started and we change our diet and we start exercising, and if we can stick with it consistently, very quickly it will require less and less and less effort. I wouldn't say it becomes easy very quickly, but it becomes much less difficult quite quickly if we're consistent. It quickly gets substantially less difficult, I would say. Now, we never are free of that. We never don't have to put in any effort at all. But if we're consistent, it can relatively rapidly get to a point where, it's maintenance and we still have to eat well and we still have to exercise. But the amount of effort it takes to do that can become relatively minimal because we're used to it. And we've, once, or also, let's say when it comes to exercise, first when we haven't exercised in years and we're very unfit, it's really hard to exercise. It's physically difficult to exercise. But once we've exercised regularly, our fitness improves very rapidly if we do it regularly. And then it becomes physically much easier to exercise. And as we get used to it in terms of, the internal investment we have to do to push ourselves to do it, it becomes easier and easier as we get used to it. So it gets to a point relatively rapidly where, it's always going to take some effort, but it takes much, much, much less effort. And it gets to a point where it's just maintenance. Yeah, we have to remind ourselves and push ourselves to eat well. We have to remind ourselves and push ourselves to exercise. But it's nothing like what it was in the beginning when we had to get started. And all of these things are exactly the same here. The more we invest in making our hearts, in bringing our hearts in line with our minds, the more we invest in making our values, the more we invest, in making our feelings match and reflect our values and beliefs, the greater the sense of internal wholeness that we're going to have, the more seamless our sense of self and our experience of self is going to be, and the greater our well-being and sense of fulfillment are going to be. Now, and considering the flip side of that, the cost, of having a poor state of well-being, of feeling the tension and the stress and all the negative things that come along with knowing that we're not living up to our values and our expectations, and knowing that our behavior, really doesn't reflect what we value, and that there's a big gap between our behavior and the lives that we're living in our values. That takes a very big toll. And keeping that in mind, it's a very good idea. It makes a lot of sense, and it's worth investing the necessary effort to avoid having to damage control that later, right? If we invest in our health, the more we invest in our health, the less we'll have to invest in illness. The more we invest in the alignment of our hearts with our minds, the more we invest in the alignment of our feelings with our values and beliefs, the less we'll have to invest in closing that gap because we've already brought them into line, and the less we'll have to invest in repairing the damage and the unwell-being that can result from that. And the same way that when we start improving our diet and start exercising, it takes a lot of effort. When we want to start addressing these things, there's no way to do this without allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, and to confront ourselves and ask ourselves confronting questions. And it's not such an easy thing to do if we're doing it for real and we're doing it honestly in a way that it's really going to make a difference. We have to really commit and put in the mental and emotional effort to be able to confront ourselves like that, and to allow ourselves to be able to be that vulnerable. And also just the process of going through the thought and having these, these conversations, asking the questions, thinking about them, discussing them with ourselves, with someone else, verbally in writing. That's something that takes a lot of effort too. But if we can muster up the courage to confront ourselves despite that discomfort, and to start this conversation, to ask these questions and start thinking about them and discussing them, very quickly it becomes less difficult. It becomes less uncomfortable. And relatively quickly, we can get to a point where the gap really starts to close. And our lives come closer to our values. And we feel more whole and complete and seamless and healthy and fulfilled. And there'll always be maintenance, and we always have to be on top of this. But if we can, have the courage to get it started and to put in the large amount of effort that it takes to get started, pretty quickly we can get to a point where, we don't have to invest that much time, and it doesn't have to be that uncomfortable to maintain it and to make that gap gradually even smaller and smaller, and to bring our feelings closer and closer to our values. Once, we've done the groundwork and sort of gotten used to the work and brought them, substantially closer, it becomes easier and easier to continue bringing them closer and closer. And the value, the benefit of bringing our lives in line with our values, bringing our feelings in line with our beliefs, again, it can't be overstated. And it will be reflected in our physical health, in our mental health, in our emotional well-being, and all of those things will be affected by closing that gap, will be improved drastically by closing that gap. If you haven't yet, click on the subscribe button, then click on the notification bell to see future videos. And please, again, share the link wherever you share things on social media, Facebook, wherever it is, WhatsApp groups, WhatsApp status, to help this message reach more people. This has been the Bites of Judaism podcast. This podcast has been made possible by Mr. and Mrs. David and Malki Smetana. If you found it valuable, please leave a 5-star rating and a review. It really does help it reach more people. And tell your friends about it. If you haven't yet, you can subscribe on all the major podcast platforms at rabbiglick.link/podcast. To dedicate a future episode of the podcast, send an email to podcast@rabbiglick.com. See you next time.